Okay, right. So one for everyone then. How much effort do you think we should be putting into securing IoT supply chains, especially say compared to the wider ICT community? Is it higher stakes, lower stakes, more at risk, less at risk? Is it the same? Is it different? What do you think?
So if I can start off on that, if you don't mind, only because just at lunchtime I was talking about this, and it sort of came up in that plenary session earlier about the cost and responsibility across supply chains for embedding security. And it really is interesting because we see things like security as a cost, and it is, and there's financial burden, there's economic cost that one can imagine, just like testing has got some cost, right? But there's also maybe functionality or performance cost. So I think if you saw John Goodacre's plenary presentation this morning, he talked about 0 to 5% being the overhead for the digital security by design process using the Morello board. Sorry, you missed that one, Amyas. But that cost, we have to think about. So some people might say, well, we'll invest 10% of cost in terms of creating our product, and we'll have that as security. And that's been one thing that we've used for a long time in systems development. You guys have been in for a long time developing software systems, for example, or hardware, where they say it's just a percentage cost. And speaking to Peter Davies and Peter Sherman from Cisco over lunch, actually, if you think of cost like that, it's a strange thing, because the cost that you should be spending is how secure can you make your product that it works, in a sense, because you're securing something, you're securing the safety of your device, right? And we don't say how much should we spend on safety, we think we've got to make it safe. So the question is, how much should people spend on IoT security? It's about providing a secure solution that people will buy and be confident in. And that may be a lot, it may be a little. But I don't think that we can really say, well, actually, your component's in a really important area. It's this IoT device, and it's really important, so you should spend a lot on it. People will spend a lot on it if it is necessitated to sell that product, that it's secure. If it's less so, I'm afraid they'll spend less on the security, because ultimately, most companies are around to make money. That's a fact. That's the number one driver. And I think if we don't recognize that, then we're living in a sort of false version of reality, and it just won't apply. So that's my view on how much you should spend. Spend as much as you need to get your function done. And equally, if you are buying something from down your supply chain, you've got to think about where you're going to sell it to, and of course you've got to think of regulation, no doubt about that. But ultimately you're driven by the environment you're in, and you can say, well, I want this much security, and you've got to get that negotiated between.
I actually think, just to work on that a bit more,
yes.
So it's all about risk, right? It's about risk management, and IoT use cases are very different, it depends on the context. I'll give you an example. So we worked on some stuff for assisted robots inside theatre that are doing knee and hip surgeries. You don't want those things to be compromised in some way, so they actually don't connect them to the internet, and they have other ways to manage the security and the operations to those robots. But equally, you can imagine a scenario where you haven't put the right security controls in those robots. What's the impact from a cost point of view to not putting in security those products? It's death, potentially, and safety is a really massive impact. And what goes alongside that is insurance, I think. Insurance premiums for not having the right security controls in place, and I think you'll see that coming through the pipe, if you think, in the not too distant future, because all the guys have got to underwrite this. It's going to land on the CFO's paper. If you haven't put the right security controls in place, your premium is this. If you have, great, it's this. And I think that's going to be interesting.
Can I add a little bit to that? I mean, it's all about risk management, and the amount of it's the opposite of cost benefit. It's how much it's going to cost you to rectify a problem or how much it's going to cost you in insurance or whatever it is. And that's where you set your level of the amount of money that you invest.
I was going to add an interesting multiples of thoughts and cross references on this one. So if you consider, my world, if you like, which is very deeply embedded IoT, okay, very resource limited, got to be low cost. Yet it's expected to have the same level of capability and security and performance as a PC or an iPhone, which we change every year, 2 years. But I've got to put it in a device that's going to be active for 20 years and be maintained. Then depending on which client we're talking to, it's brand reputation, for instance. Their product absolutely cannot be seen to have any failings. Cool, how much are you prepared to pay for that? Yeah, well, we need it to be the lowest cost. Well, no, hang on a second. And so there's these balances to be put out, which is where do they place this? And then the development side of that for a abstracted device that's working on top of an OS is a lot simpler. All of the security is managed. Okay, Apple do that, Google do that, whatever it happens to be, it's managed and extracted. For the deeply embedded guys, they've got to take care of all of it, and the development cycle is much more complex and more difficult to manage over time and manufacture. So there's a really difficult cost ratio that comes in, as well as managing sides like risk and all the factors that affect ultimately the corporation and what they can do with a device. So.
There's a comment from the audience.
Right, so that was my question I was lining up, right? It's, has anybody engaged in the insurance underwriting market yet and actually found out, is there some kind of correlation between the risk premium they're offering a business compared to how much they're protecting their IoT infrastructure? I've got no idea.
So it was a question that right back at the beginning of the IoTSF that we considered. We thought that actually what we're trying to do is offset the risk that you would have to, the investment you would have to put in to offset the risk, the cost of insurance. But we couldn't actually find out what that is. And I think there's a few instances recently, like Hiscox and people like that, who have refused to pay out on certain vulnerabilities in systems. And so at the moment, I think you're on the right line, and it was this was 5 years ago we were thinking about it, but we haven't actually managed to resolve that yet. It'd be nice if somebody could tell us.
And we have seen an evolving theme there as well, with some certain insurance companies start to raise the question around that. So that, I think it's not a short-term thing, but it's definitely coming back on the agenda.
Because that's where some of this ROI comes back, isn't it?
Completely, yeah.
20% off your premium,
It's all about the dollars, the money at the end of the day, isn't it? Yeah.
I think one of the things that I think you missed the earlier plenary, which came a bit later, which is no problem, but we mentioned about IoT evolving, and one thing I said, insurance came up on that panel as well, and Peter Davies in particular, with his work on cyber resilience, which involves lots of academics, lots of companies, has been talking to insurance companies in the UK, in the US as well. And we have to understand that market is all changing somewhat. I gave the example of one of my former students who started a company, sold it out for millions of pounds to an organisation called Coalition, which are an insurance broker. And much is the same as when you get your insurance at home and they say, have you got a mortise lock, five lever lock, have you got window key locks, etc. It reduces your premium. Yeah? So we do it because we don't want to get broken into, right? So we're protecting our assets just as we do in any other way, and it's a risk-based thing, but we're also then getting some benefit from that in terms of the change in insurance. And what we are seeing, certainly with what Coalition are trying to do, is trying to be a little bit preventative as well, and then reducing the risk, so being a little bit preventative, working with the insurance providers to say, okay, well, if they do this and they've got our support throughout, will you offset that against some premium? So that actually gives them a slice to provide a new service. So it's not only the insurers, there's also this other market that's coming in, but we should be prepared to see the cyber insurance market changed somewhat as it's, some of the old methods, the traditional methods for calculating risk even, so are very difficult in a cyber environment because it's so dynamic. I think, that's much different to, say, let's say vehicle insurance, right? Because the crashes happen in a certain way. Well, at the moment, crashes happen in a certain way. Cars have got certain functionality and standards, but we may see that change as well as they become more connected and autonomous. How do we see that market changing? But insurance companies, I think, will always try and get out of payments if they can.
They'll try and make a penny. I guess from, if you think about it, is that, they're starting to wake up to it, but they also want some standard to put it against. And as yet, we haven't got to the point where we've got standards to actually test cyber resilience of a product, because that's kind of got to mature as well before we get to that point. And then it comes back to where we've been working, which is, well, actually, we've got to have this body of evidence, chain of truth perspective, if you like, of, well, my product is made in this way, it's developed and created with these things, this is how we've done it, this is what we've tested it against, to then go and put it up against some standard an insurance company wants. But, abstracted thought becomes, well, actually, that's a great way of wheedling out the really cheap stuff that gets imported that hasn't had any testing, that's of dubious content, not really sure what's in there, that's just put on the market, but it's cheap, so folks buy it on eBay because it says it's a lock. Yeah, really, is it? Okay, well, what does it lock? And how do I get into it? And how vulnerable is it? And people don't get asked those questions, so it's that legislation requirement because of insurance, because there's a penalty for not getting it or a reward for doing it. And so it will mature, I think, in time.